Heyo guys, so today I'm going to be doing a video that's going to go over basically every step that I would do to draw a paw. I know I get a lot of messages regarding how to do paws. It's a constant struggle, and if you're a furry artist, it's kind of one of the staples when it comes to drawing characters. So starting off, I use ClipStudio Paint. I do have the EX version. I highly recommend this program. I'll probably do a video on this later, basically the programs I use, how I feel about them, and not only the program I use currently, but previous programs. But starting off with the files, so typically I do a pretty large file because it's easier to downsize later than upgrade the size later. So I always start off with a large file. I typically do 3000 by 3000 with a resolution of 1200. I do have it on PX. And yeah, so this illustration. So starting off, I typically just have a canvas, fill that in. Okay, I usually zoom way in for the sketch. It's just, I don't know, that's what I do, so that way in case it's larger than I intend, I can always just kind of scale it later. It is a sketch, so I don't have to worry about line quality or anything like that. So for sketches, I typically use the same G pen tool that I would for drawing the line art itself. I don't really, between the sketching and lines, I typically don't use any other brushes. I do have a couple of presets down at the bottom using the same G pen that I've renamed, and those just have a specific set brush size and specific stabilization. Those are the two that I probably adjust the most drawing to drawing. This, as you can see, it says changes how much to stabilize input from pen tablet or tablet pen. I typically use about 30 when I'm sketching, but then when I go to drawing the lines, I bump it way up to like 60 or 70. That's a preference thing, and most everything in this video is going to be preference based or just how I do it. Does not mean it is the only way to do things. There's plenty of right ways to draw just about anything. Okay, so for a paw, start with a circle. I usually cut it in half, and then I actually kind of make this peace sign shape, as you can see, and then I actually just kind of make this chevron, and that's going to be kind of the paw pad area, and then I divide this into 4 for the toes. This is just going to be a 4-toed paw. If you wanted to add a 5th toe, you'd kind of add on like that, or a thumb or something like that, but for this video I'm just going to keep it to the simple 4. So typically then what I do is I kind of draw the wrist, just come out to the side, round off the top. I've now got to make a critical decision of which way do I want the paw. Do I want it to go this way or that way, and I'm going to pick this way so I can do shading from above, because you're more likely going to be drawing paws with shading where the shadows are underneath. Unless your character is like upside down or has its foot way up in the air for some reason. So I typically kind of draw a circle in that center chevron. That. I did not do warm-ups like I usually do before this, and that's because I kind of want to make some errors so I can show you even how I fix those or adjust as I go. I see a lot of YouTubers will have like this perfectly clean-cut tutorial. And I personally, when I'm looking for tutorials, I find the ones where they're showing those, oh, I made this too large, or oh, I messed that up, and so they show their fixing process. But as you can see here, I like to put little fluffs of fur between the toes. If it's a short hair character, then that's not going to be really necessary, but sometimes people like to put those because it does break up the color between the pads. I mean, the toes, when it comes to the nails, I mean, if it's a small nail, I mean, it's basically a triangle shape, but then it has a curve on top, so it's more like a half circle, or a quarter of a circle, if I could get my shapes right. And then I usually put a little bit of curve on the bottom part. So like if I do this one, super simple, that weird half circle, but then I put a little bit of curve on the bottom. And that's how I make claws. I do struggle with consistency in regards to the size. Sometimes it's noticeable, sometimes it's not. I mean, it's okay if they're not the perfect size, but if for some reason you're really struggling, like this one ends up spending like way too small, you can literally just lasso select, which is over here. It's a select tool where it lets you draw the line that you want. Copy, paste, and then now this is on a different layer, so I can deselect it. So then I can literally just move it over. I wouldn't suggest putting it directly behind because you're not going to learn those hand motions you need to learn. And those consistency motions, you're essentially just going to baby yourself. And if you're in a pinch and you need something done really quick, I mean, that works fine. Or if you need something to be dead on perfect. But for the most part, it works better if you're forcing yourself to learn that muscle memory. Which I'm okay with the size that claw was. I'll undo that. Alright, and most people that, I don't know, I see this happen a lot. A lot of people think that, okay, well this is fine, this is all I need to do, moving on to the line. But I actually typically will do one more sketch than I think I need. Because the more sketched you design, or more sketched you have something, the more likely you're going to be happy with the line work. Because the lines, whether you want them to or not, are going to greatly reflect your sketch. Or at least that's my experience. I mean, if I'm sketching something, I have a bad habit of thinking, like, example right here, oh, well, I don't like how far back that slope is, so I'll move it back up here. I'll do that during the line, but then I don't. I forget about it, or I do something else, and next thing you know, I'm closely lining this, and then I don't have that arch where I want it. So I'm going to do another sketch. So I usually make a new layer, drop the previous sketch to a low opacity, and then I start sketching a new one. Except for this time, I kind of pretend like I'm going to line it, so I have it more close to what I want. Here I typically increase my brush size a little bit, just personal preference. I like to increase the stabilization and do that. Now, when it comes to sketching, it's okay to do these frantic, over-the-top lines where you're just kind of doing little tiny sections that don't actually line up. That's okay when it comes to sketching. Now, what you don't want to do is do that during the line work, because that's how you make it look very fuzzy. Unless you're doing a sketching style artwork, that's not good. If you're going for something more like what my style is, very cartoony, clean, smooth lines, then that's what you want to do, is on the line art part, focus on the long, smooth lines, and I'll get into that. So another thing is, you'll notice I had a circle the very first time, but then the second time I kind of had this bean shape. I find that for me, I find it more visually appealing to have it that bean shape, because it's not a perfect circle, which can sometimes, I don't know, look way too cartoony for me. Get that paw. Okay, so yeah, and overall, it's always good to start looking at references and studying. Like, I figured out how to draw paws like this after lots and lots of just looking at pictures of actual paws, looking at how other artists draw paws, and lots of just studying. And by studying, I mean just drawing over and over and over the same types of things. Draw from different angles, yada yada yada. And when you get the sketching kind of figured out, then you start studying the line weights if you're doing line weighted art. Start studying the shading, stuff like that. Okay. Another place that I will sometimes put a little tuft of fur is right here. The base of the paw pad. You'll see some people put little lines to show how poofy the paw pad is. I sometimes do, sometimes don't. Just kind of depends on how I'm feeling. Rotate the canvas, and that's a big thing. Never be afraid to rotate your canvas, because sometimes you just can't get that angle well unless you rotate it. Like for me, I'm really good at making angles this way. When it comes to this way, I'm not usually good at getting what I want. Right, so I'm just doing a paw, so I'll just cut the paw off there. Okay. So now I can get rid of the under sketch, and it's more like what I want. And here I can look at it, and one useful thing when it comes to art is always looking at your artwork and trying to judge it. Sometimes, if you're not as experienced in this, you'll need to step away from it for a while, come back. You know that feeling when you work really hard for something, you worked like 3 hours straight staring at it, and then you finish it and you're like, this is awesome, but then you wake up the next morning after your frantic drawing craze at like 3 a.m., and then you look at it and realize it looks like trash. The proportions are way off, but you already spent so much time shading it that you can't go back and edit it. That's where sometimes taking a step back helps, or gaining kind of like a perspective on your own art, realizing parts that don't really fit in. Like, it's kind of weird how this toe is further from the side of the paw pad than this one. So I'm actually going to rotate this. And another useful thing when it comes to sketching is don't be afraid to like break the sketch apart like I just did. So I used the lasso tool, selected it, drew around the lines I wanted to move, wanted to edit, transform, scale down, rotate, so then I can move it how I want. Then I can deselect and just fix the missing lines or whatever needs to be fixed. It's like, I find that a lot more, not necessarily natural because it's still very cartoony, but I find that more to what I was aiming for. Okay, so now what I'll do is I make that opaque, but before I do that, since this is just a paw and I want it to come out high quality, increase the size of the sketch. One thing to remember is you never want to do the line on a way zoomed in and then stretch it outward. So just to show you what I'm meaning, like let's say I don't increase that, and let's say it's actually smaller. So if you're like me, you're not using vector art, then this will affect you. If you're using vector art, vector lines adjust to when you size them. So if I make a vector line that's really small, and then I increase the size of it, it's gonna look just as clear as it was small. But most artists, because vectors can be tricky or annoying or sometimes limiting, give lots of limitations. If you don't know how to use them, then you're just using normal lines, then this will affect you. So like, let's say, oh wow, I like this line so much, but then I realize it's really small. If I select both of these, increase the size, when you look, now it's kind of fuzzy, looks kind of bad, and that's because we zoomed way in. Now if I get rid of that, I'm gonna actually move this paw down, it's gonna drive me insane. Okay, now if I draw a line while it's the size that I want it to be, I'll draw that line. You can see it's a lot more smooth, and part of that's also the resolution I have. If I drew this on a low resolution to start off with, then you'd have that fuzziness. And sometimes you kind of are forced into the resolution depending on what software you're trying to put this artwork into, like if it's for a web page or something. Sometimes like avatar icons or stuff like that can be really limiting. But here, I'm just making an example so I don't have to worry about any type of sizing and just do whatever I want. Alright, hardest part for me is always deciding where to start my lines. I usually pick somewhere that I can put one line and then everything just kind of connects. Key to having nice lines is these long, smooth lines. Stabilization definitely helps. I'm actually going to increase it a bit, 70. That means it's going to kind of drag behind my cursor, kind of like lag, but it's more on purpose. So then I can navigate it around edges that I want. It will always be difficult to connect lines. That's just something that's going to take practice. Sometimes you can kind of cheat, stop it there, and then kind of jerry-rig a line and race apart or something like that. I prefer to just do this over and over till I get it exactly how I want. Hotkeys are going to be your friend. If you have a tablet that allows you to press a button and it automatically inputs a key code or some sort of like keystroke, that's a term, keystroke, that's going to be your best friend. I have one that's the top left. I always have my hand over it, and that's the undo button. That's probably my most used button, simply because this right here. And it's okay to deviate from your sketch some if you think it's a better change. Like, I just moved those just a little bit. I try to avoid having lines that end like that, just because it kind of looks weird. Kind of messes with your eye a little bit. I'm gonna actually start on this end. Also, these are not any special kinds of brushes I've downloaded or anything. These are just the basic brushes that it starts with, and I've just tweaked the settings to something I like. And also, for backgrounds for the canvases, I typically don't do white. I typically use some sort of like middle color, like a gray or gray-like color, simply because when it comes to the coloring and lighting, it's going to be so much nicer. Okay, I do have autosave turned on just in case. I do not have a good laptop, and so crashing is a possibility. I've never had ClipStudio cause the crash though. It's always been usually I have music playing or something and Google Chrome decides to just die on me. Okie dokie. So I've got the top part of the paw. You can see here I'm rotating the canvas, so I can keep getting the angles that feels natural for my hand. You can see here I brought this forward, that kind of adds a little bit of depth to the paw. Some tufts of fur here. And typically, like, the further away the paw is in view, the less tufts of fur I put, because something that's further away is not going to be as detailed. And if you have like super details, super close up, the viewer's not going to be able to see them just from looking at the image. Like, if I was to zoom way in and put these little like hatch marks here, when I zoom back out, I can't even tell they're there. So there's no real sense in spending time doing stuff like that. There are some subtle things you can do that can help that do require zooming in, but nothing like that. Connect that. And sometimes you can see, like, you'll have a little part of a line that doesn't seem flush. You can go back and actually fill those in. Or use an eraser and just kind of buff that out. Okay, so you can see here, I have my line art. Next step's going to be the coloring. And for that, what I do is, first I'm going to clear up previous layers, just because I can't stand to have an insane mess of layers. And trust me, I use a lot of layers. I usually make my line art have a red layer color. This does not affect the layer other than visually that's red, so it helps you find it easier. Or you can name the layers. I prefer the color code. For the colors, I typically use yellow, and I'll get to why I skip orange. You'll see that when it comes to the shading. So I'm just, for the sake of the tutorial, just going to color my own paw, mainly because A, uses white and black, which can be really tricky when it comes to shading, and I'm going to show some tips for that. And also, it's so familiar I don't have to use a ref. So for black, I never use a true black. I always go to like just a dark gray, and that's because you'll actually be able to add shading and highlights. It's not so black that it absorbs all lighting. So for the paw pads, I have this dark gray, and what I usually use it is the fill bucket for things that the lines already outline, and then for things that aren't automatically defined color-wise, I actually go in with the pen and outline that color. But first what I do is I select the outside, which I have follow adjacent pixel on, and I have multiple layers on. So I select the outside of the paw or outside of the shape I'm trying to color. I invert the selection, so it's now selected everything in it, and this does include the lines. I usually do this just because it tends to remove the fuzzy white bits around the edges, and for me it kind of gives me more sanity. And what I do is I'm going to create what I call a net layer. It is not an official term or anything, that's just what I call it. Turn off multiple layers, so I just have this black background for it that I can then put opaque, and that way it kind of gives me a visual boundary of what's paw and what's not. And I'm going to make that be blue. So back to the yellow layer, I'm going to fill in the paw with the colors it needs. So the paw's still selected, so I can't draw outside of it. What I'm going to do is draw the border. My character is yellow, little toes, so do that. I personally like to put whatever colors here as the fuzz in between, because it kind of shows that difference. That's the only place I really need to put that line. So then when I go to fill in the colors, that will be a boundary if I was thinking and had multiple selected. Okay, so now I have multiple selected, it should just fill in that area. When it comes to my fill bucket, I almost always have some form of closed gap, just in case there's that one line that doesn't connect that one pixel width. And I always put area scaling on, and I put it at like 1 or 2 pixels, so that way when it fills, it automatically just kind of goes under the line just a bit. It works if you have kind of thick lines like I use, and if you use super thin lines, this is not going to work. Don't do that. Alright, so here I'm using that. I'm going to use a little bit of a darker gray. Here I'm using that dark gray instead of black, so that way I can color it and it will look like black. When it comes to white, I typically kind of do the same thing. I make it a little bit of an off-white, and I make it match something that's already there. So I have yellow toes, so it's a little bit of an off-white with yellow. And see, your eyes just instantly kind of read it as white, even though technically it's not. So, right, so there's my color layer. Next, I will be going over how I shade. So I usually use my paintbrush tool. I use oil paint, but honestly, I have it with so much paint and density and color stretch that's almost like the pen tool anyways. I have it at a medium hardness, and that's my brush density, and I have a pretty high stabilization too. Some artists will fill this area and then remove the parts that are going to be lit up. I like to paint in the shadow, as you would say. Some artists like to paint in the light. I like to paint in the shadow, so that's what I'm going to do. So what I'm going to do is I use a mask layer or clip layer. So I have this layer, I'm going to color orange because it's my shading. So then it kind of makes a nice little rainbow. So I click that, making sure that my shadow layer is above my color layer, and this allows anything I draw in here to kind of work like a selection tool. So if I draw over here, you don't see it. It's there. If I turn off clip, you can see it, but it's not affecting anything because there's nothing under it that can catch it. So it's kind of like this layer, the yellow layer, is like a bowl, and this layer is like water just falling straight down. So if I draw over here, this would catch it, but outside of it, you don't see it. Okay, so on this clip layer, what I usually do is I do multiply, and I just kind of pick halfway and then adjust it later. So when it comes to the shading and lighting, I try to imagine that there's light source over here and how that would cast on this. This is where doing studies on shading comes useful, because I'm already familiar with, well, if there's a shadow on that side, then it's going to create a shadow like that. And I can just color it in. If I want to increase it so it's easier to see, I can do that, or decrease it. I usually increase it pretty high till I'm done. So right now it looks like a crazy dark shadow, which is good for hard contrasts. If you're trying to have like some super intense light on the other side, that works, but here I'm just using that aspect so I can see better. I don't know, I have a very outlining focused brain, so I tend to outline things and then color it in. I can increase my brush size here to fill it in faster if I want. I tend to like to use the paintbrush tool for the shadows just because it has a very subtle, soft edge. Might not even be visible, but it works for me. That part's gonna be dark too. I don't know why I was being so careful right there. Yeah, you want to keep in mind things such as basically the toes are like a sphere, so you'll shadow it. You'll shade it and put shadows as if it's a sphere. The claw would cast a shadow too, so if you have a light that was like more above the toe, you'd want to cast the claw's shadow. Or if this is resting on top of something, or it's casting a shadow below. The wrist is kind of like a cylinder. So do it like that. Most of the rest of this is all going to be shadows. I'm just going to make a really big brush. It's okay to have like some areas where they get really soft. That's okay. So here you'll see it's a pretty intense shadow. I can increase or decrease. I'm going to actually have it pretty intense, 57. And so next, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to make another clip layer for the same area. I'm going to hit new layer. And you'll see if I make a new layer that is in between the clip layer and the layer that it's clipping to, which is this color layer, it'll automatically make it another clip layer, which is really nice. And you can still drag it above it and it'll still be doing that same thing. Works the same way as the shading. Except for here, what I love to use is the shadow airbrush tool. It's a very soft airbrush tool. I've also adjusted it some. I don't have any stabilization on though, because there's like so little line, it's just airbrushed. So here what I like to do is I tend to put a more blue-like hue in areas of intense shadow. And by intense shadow, I mean areas where it's fur to fur or skin to skin contact. So crevices, areas where there's two things beside each other that would create an even more dense shadow. I usually have it pretty subtle. Right, but then to contrast that, make another clip layer. I usually use kind of an orange or a yellow. I use yellow on this one. Actually, no, I'll use orange. Areas that can be kind of hard to see due to black, I'll typically do a glow dodge. Have it very faint. It helps, especially with some of the later layers that I use. I found it helps. It's a subtle glow that kind of lets the viewer still see what's going on. Right, and next what I do is I'm going to actually make a highlights layer. I'll put it on top. I usually use orange or yellow as my light. You could, if the specific thing you're drawing requires a white light, you could use that, but unless I absolutely have to, I prefer to use yellow or orange tinted lights. Here you'll see I did put some on this side, and that's because the light actually reflects. If you've taken an art class, they've most likely gone over that. Light is a reflective source, so objects around it are going to bounce light off slightly. So you're going to have this effect of light kind of caressing every side. Right. What I also do is I color the lines. To do that, the easiest way I have found is to, above the line layer, make another clip layer and just take your pen tool. I usually make it larger and I remove stabilization just so it moves fast, so I can color. So for this yellow, fairly simple. I find the area that is the darkest yellow. I select it. I usually move it along the scale just a little bit, and you want to make it darker. You can see here it shows the comparison. So you want to put it somewhere where it seems very dark compared to that, but not black. It can be really close to black, but and then just simply draw over it. When it comes to what parts or what color, if there's like an intersection or overlapping or something like that, that's just up to you. You'll kind of create your own mental formula for how to do that. I typically just go with, if it's in the foreground, it gets the color. You can see I'm just doing little tiny strokes when it comes to the edges meeting. That's because it's easier to undo a tiny stroke when it comes to something like this than it is a large stroke. See, I've colored in all the yellow. It's easy enough. Same with the white. Select the darkest area, and you'll see because I used an off-white and colored overlays, it's reading as a purple. That's okay. Just go a bit darker with the purple. If you feel like it's still too dark, go up a little bit. And if you ever want to, you can do a lighter gray for over here where it's in light versus over there where it's in dark. So I'm actually going to do that here because it's pretty harsh contrast. That there. Then when it gets there, I'll switch it over. So I'm going to select dark white, or this dark lavender. Darker, but not black. So it kind of helps that pop out. Now, what you can be is you can kind of be messy with some colors and then go in and refine the lines with the others. So like that. Which, when it comes to black, you do want to outline in black. So I should probably not been that messy. And if you want the stabilization on, just so you can correct as you go. I kind of flip-flop between having it off when I line things. It's okay if it's a little off. I mean, I like to zoom in on artwork. Not everybody does. It's up to you on how, like, zoom friendly you want your artwork to be. Okay. If you ever need to reselect the color, just use the eyedrop tool. On my tablet pen, I have it set, there's a button on the side, and if I hold it, I have it set to just automatically become an eyedrop tool. I find that very useful. I use it a bunch. Alright. So now we have that. The next step that I do personally is, it is under the line, but it is not any type of clip layer. But I am going to reselect, or I could use that net layer and select. Reselect, and I go over to my paint tool. I usually use this preset, just pastel yellow. Make it small, make sure it has a high stabilization. And then what I do is I actually go back and softly draw. Increase this. Softly draw the inside of almost every shape, basically. I do have it as a glow dodge. I'm gonna decrease it some. This kind of goes back to that reflective light. And it also is nice because it kind of makes things stand out more, especially when you zoom out. I'll show you here in a second. Whew, way zoomed out. Okay. See there, it kind of helps, and when you do that throughout the drawing, it kind of keeps areas from like between the toes from just completely disappearing. It's also a way that you can be way zoomed in and see if you have any issues or anything you need to fix. This is honestly one of my favorite parts when it comes to doing a commission. for a piece of work is this way zoomed in doing these lines. You can increase them, get a more shiny effect. I am a huge sucker for effects. I love to go in and add all those subtle little layers of light that probably most people don't notice, but all put together create this really amazing eye-catching work. I see other people though that can do it so much better than I do, and I'm like, I'm jealous. I try my best though. And that's one thing that can really help you improve your artwork is if you have a commission or somebody's asking for artwork and you decide to do it as a gift, just like always try your best. Even if you're not motivated, try to figure out what it is that gets you motivated. Motivation is something I hear a lot of artists struggle with. It's kind of like artist block in a way. Just like I don't know what to draw, everything I draw doesn't feel right. Just kind of in a slump. That's when I usually go inspiration seeking. I try to find, I don't know, an animated video that I'm like, wow, this is so awesome, and it makes me want to make something. Or some people that can be the turn off is looking at other art, and then they feel like, oh, I could never make something like this. That's when you need to try to find something that makes you feel like, I can do this. Some people it's music, some people it's even a movie, like watching a new movie or a movie that they love. I'll do that sometimes. I'm more so of a music person though. Almost got all these in. And almost all parts of this process I have learned from watching other people draw, looking at tutorials, or even just like zooming in really close on artwork and just trying to study like, how did they do that? How does that look like that? Or how do they get that effect? Watching speed paint, stuff like that all really help. And yeah. And no one owns this skill. That's another thing. I have met very few, but a couple people who say that's a form of stealing. But it's not. I mean, you're studying how it's done. That is a big part of art. That's why there's been, I mean, the college I went to, part of what we had to do was literally look at what are considered classical works of art, and then we copy them, never claiming that it's ours, but we copy it and look at it. Just so we can see how is that shading done. Granted, it's a master artist, so they've been dead long ago. So you never want to copy someone's art that doesn't want it to be copied, and you should never copy it, or probably ever post it. You should never really post copies, but you should never go around saying it's yours or anything, because it's a study. You're not going to go around showing your study notes to everybody because it's not yours. It's your professor's information or stuff you learned in your textbook. Share with them instead the textbook so they can also learn. Alright, so now I can adjust the glow if I want. I might actually make this more yellow or orange. I mean, not yellow. So what I do to alter the color of something is I often go to Tonal Corrections under the Edit tab. I'll go over to Gradient Map. I just click Sunset Red because it's red. Now it is this orange color. I could change it if I wanted. I could go Edit, Tonal Corrections again, and change it on the hue sliding. I could give it this like blue color, but I wanted the orange color, so I'll just not save that. And then I am a sucker for sparkles. So what I do is I'll go over to my brush tool. Now Droplet is a tool that I downloaded. ClipStudio has a pretty amazing like resource store, but most of it's all free. You can just like browse around and find what you want. This one's called Droplet. Most all of them are in Japanese, so can't really help you out there, but just browse around, you'll find stuff you like. Just put the sparkles, glow dodge. I like to put them really faint. I think I'm gonna actually put more orange glow on it. Almost like there's some sort of orange fire or something affecting this. Now you can go too crazy with effects, and that is something to be careful of. You don't want to look like, you don't want the artwork to look like it's been through 40,000 layers of like Snapchat filters or something. Deselect that line. Here we go. So that's how I do Paws. So you can really see how the little outline really affects it. Here, I'll actually show some where I just remove certain layers so you can see what it's like. If I don't do the line color, that's what it's like. Line color is really subtle, but I love it. When it comes to, where is it? Yeah, those are the sparkles. This is the painting outline, the highlight line as I like to call it. You can see it's arguably one of the things that changes the artwork the most. I mean, apart from obviously the line and color and basic shading. When it comes to effects, it really affects the artwork. It can be tedious, especially on a full body drawing or something, but it really helps. Especially also this, like, I mean, this shows more light is affecting the paw directly from underneath than if you did this. If you did this, it gives more of a hint, like this is probably closer to the ground. Here you can see that's without the shading, that's with the shading. That's without the color. You can often tell if you've done enough effects and shading if you remove the color, and you can still kind of see a form. And that's just the net. I can actually get rid of that. Actually, wait, there's one more thing I usually do. I love things that are kind of sticker-like, so sometimes I'll take this net back here. Now, ClipStudio, I do have to say I wish I had some sort of tool, or maybe I just don't know where it's at. But something that gives an outline. Photoshop and like the layer effects or something has something like that. But it's still pretty easy to make one. It just requires a couple more steps. So I just duplicate that layer, and on the lower part of the layer, I make sure I don't have multiple layers selected. Then I increase the area scaling. Just pick 10. You can see now it has a slight outline. If I wanted to do another 10, I'd just click it again. Decrease it so it's just a subtle outline. Do whatever I want. But yeah, so that is how I make Paws. And yeah, I hope you liked this video, and please subscribe. I know this is one of my first videos in a long time, but I do hope to make more, and please let me know if there's any topics you would like to see. I'm trying to just do topics where I just take one item or one thing and I just try to draw it and just talk through how I draw, because it's kind of how my brain thinks. And then that way y'all can see a process from start to finish with all the aspects being incorporated instead of some quick, this is how I sketch this, and then that's it. Alright, well, thank you, and see you around.